Welcome to Science of Slink, the evidence-based pole podcast with me, your host, Dr. Rosy. And just to be very clear, I'm not a medical doctor. I cannot treat or diagnose. I'm the type of doctor that does research and reads research articles. And that's part of what we're going to be doing together here in the podcast. We're going to be reading research. We're going to be synthesizing that down into things that you can apply to your pole practice. We're going to be talking with experts in their field and learning more. And overall, just really building our understanding of how bodies work, how we can do pole better, train more effectively, train more safely, and just have a better time overall. So if that sounds like something you're interested in and you want to come get a little bit nerdy with us, come on in. Today, we're going to talk about 3 things that every home poler should know. If you're dancing from home, you absolutely need to know these things, especially if you've started as a home poler, right? So you've only been working, on your own at home. Maybe you're doing like different tutorials, and these are things that are just really important for you to know for your health and safety and longevity as a mover, and also just so that pole feels good in your body and not, well, I mean, good as it can. We all know it. What's that thing that doctors always say, like, you may experience some slight discomfort? I think we've all experienced that slight discomfort for ourselves. But these are things I want everybody to know. And it's just sort of been percolating in my mind for a bit as I've been chatting with different folks and, talking with people on Instagram and in our private group. Hit me up if you want to invite to that, by the way. And I'm realizing that these are things that I know about because I've been a teacher and I've been doing pole for a while. And also, reading in the exercise science literature and sort of understanding what we know about how bodies work and how to prepare bodies for movement, and how to progress through different types of movement. But I don't know, it's one of those things where, like, I kind of have a blindness to it because, like, oh yeah, obviously this is common knowledge and everybody knows this, and everyone has this degree of knowledge of exercise science and, just generally how to do this type of movement. No, not true. Not true. This is specialized knowledge, and just because I know something doesn't mean that it's obvious to other people. So that was the inspiration for this particular episode, and I think it'll be really, really helpful for you if you pole at home like I do. Me too. Hey, home poler, fist bump. All right, so 3 different things. We're just going to start with number 1. Proper warm-up is key, and I'm going to tell you specifically what I mean by proper warm-up. And this is something I think most people know that you should warm up, I hope. That's something I definitely remember being told in PE, physical education, which is like our required exercising classes in school for folks who are from different places and may not be familiar with the American system. But I wasn't really told what goes into a proper warm-up and why we do it. So warming up is what takes your body from, let's be honest, sedentary, most of us, right? I'm sitting at a desk right now. Maybe you're sitting at a desk, maybe you're doing something else, maybe you're in a car, but probably you're not doing pole while you listen to this. So how do you get your body from not doing pole to ready to do pole? And why do we do these things? So the first thing that you always want in a proper warm-up is you want joint mobilization, which means moving through all the major joints of your body. And this is something that if you've taken class with me, we go through, we do it together, I cue it specifically. And the specific reason for this is specifically you want to move through your synovial joints because there's a fluid in your joints called synovial fluid, and moving through your joints literally lubricates them, literally moves that fluid around the joint. And it's actually, even if you're not warming up for something, it's very important that you do this regularly to help yourself continue to move as you age. It reduces the friction between the different parts of your body when they move. That's its purpose. And if you're not regularly sort of getting that lubrication in and moving that synovial fluid around, the long-term effects can be really deleterious to your ability to just move through that joint. So you want to move through all the major joints in your body. And I'm not being like, you don't have to do high kicks or anything, right? But you want to move most of your joints in most of the ways they can move, wake that up. It's also a really good proprioceptive warm-up, right? So you are reminding your body what it can do, where it can move in space. You're beginning to, hone or wake up or possibly even build, depending on your movement background, that that, you know, proprioceptive connection, that understanding of where your body is, and that physical sense. So it is sense. Proprioception is a sense, like sight or smelling or hearing. And some folks just need a little bit more work on it. Particularly lower degrees of proprioception is especially associated with things like hypermobility, autism. I believe I've seen some research linking it to other neurodivergences like ADD or ADHD. We're moving for our joints for that very mechanical reason, and also for a brain reason. So you got to do that. You got to do that as part of your warm-up, whatever you're doing, however you're moving. And in pole, we move our bodies in a lot of ways. We want to make sure that we're warming up everything, but sort of non-negotiable, got to be part of a warm-up. The second part of a warm-up you absolutely need, and this is the warm part of the warm-up, is you need to do cardio. You need to elevate your heart rate. And you can do this before or after the joint mobilization. It doesn't matter a whole ton. For me, for cardio, I like to do the cardio portion on the pole because it also helps to physically warm the pole. And I mean, you probably already know this if you've been pole dancing for a while, but in general, you will stick better to a warmer pole. And I don't actually know of any specific research on this, but what's been described to me by people who know more about material science as I am than I do is that there's sort of like very small holes in the pole, and as you warm it up, those holes or fissures or cracks expand, and that expansion creates a little bit more surface area, so you stick better. If anyone can corroborate or not, I'd be certainly interested in hearing more. I'm not really not a type of engineering I was ever really instructed in. So that's what I've heard. That may be apocryphal. Take that with a grain of salt. But my experience and my body experience, my students, is that in general, if the pole is physically warm to the touch, you're going to stick better. So you can incorporate that in your cardio. And then the third thing that you're always going to need in every warm-up, particularly for pole, is skill-specific preparation. So whatever it is that you're planning to do on the pole that day, and this is a very important point, especially if you're training yourself, especially if you're sort of working through tutorials and doing things and structuring your own training, plan what you're going to do in your training ahead of time, right? And that plan can be like, oh, I'm just going to freestyle, so I want to make sure that I'm warmed up for a wide variety of skills. That's perfectly fine. But specifically, if you're doing skill training, you need to prepare your body for these specific skills that you're going to be training. So this may be preparing your body to be in the position that you're going to be in. Great example for this is if you're going to be doing, you know, a lot of handstands and pushing shapes, you probably want to warm up that sort of overhead press pathway so that you're prepared for that, right? If you know you're going to be spending a lot of time on your hands, you want to make sure that you've warmed up your hands and wrists really well beyond the sort of the basic joint mobilization, and that you're also taking weight into your hands. Maybe if you've got, you know, medial or ulnar nerve tightness, maybe you add a couple of nerve glides in so that you're a little bit less restricted in your mobility. But whatever it is that you know you're going to be doing on the pole, or, you know, in floor work, or whatever it is in your training, you need to prepare your body for that specific thing, which means you have to know what it is in advance. So this is a huge thing that I'm going to talk on a lot today. You should be planning your training. Every time you get on the pole, know what you're going to be doing, prepare your body for that, and then do it. And I would also recommend, especially, again, if you're doing skill training, keeping track of things, right? So how many times you do each trick, on which side, etc. So very, very important, particularly if we're doing something kind of extreme like pole is. Pole is kind of extreme. We know this. Even something like a spin where you're holding your body weight in one or both arms, that's a pretty extreme behavior for humans. We don't do that a lot, especially as adults. So also something to think about with skill-specific preparation. In the past, I have not done static stretching. Based on more recent research, I think that probably it is okay to do static stretching, but again, this comes back to planning. You don't want to be doing static stretching in muscles that you're then going to need a lot of power from, right? So a great example here is if you know that you're going to be doing some splits moves, right? So you're like, okay, maybe I'm going to open up my hip flexors, maybe I'm going to stretch out my psoas, but also you're planning on doing, let's say, a lot of movements that require kicking. So I don't know if you're familiar with that sort of funky grip, kick, switch movement mount to brass. it's the thing I can't do. My butt's too heavy, and I've never really got the mechanics of it. So not something that's in my body. But if you're familiar with that, that requires a lot of power with your legs. So I wouldn't recommend, even if you knew you were going to be doing split stuff at the same day, I wouldn't recommend doing a lot of static stretching of your psoas. I would recommend more active mobilization. Or even better, separate those things and train them on different days so you can stretch your psoas statically before you do your splits things, and then not stretch it statically before you do your kicky things. So proper warm-up, very, very key. You got to do your joint mobilization, you got to do your cardio, you got to do your skill-specific preparation, and you have to know what the skills are that you're doing before you go into it. And hopefully this is something that, if you're taking class, is already happening for you and you don't really have to think about. And that is the joy of taking classes, right? Like when I'm doing classes for home pollers, this is what I am thinking about. And this is the structuring that I'm doing for you, so you don't have to do it. But if you're doing it on your own, very important that you do these things. All right. Second thing that I think a lot of home pollers don't necessarily hear about or don't necessarily know about is that you don't actually want to be doing high volume training of a specific trick, especially if you're a little bit earlier in your pole journey. So I see this a lot with folks who can't invert yet and really want to invert, and that's their main goal, and they are just working on inverting and they're not doing anything else, and particularly pretty early on in your pole journey, right? So like, within like the first year, let's say you spend 3 months only working on inverts and nothing else, I would strongly recommend against that for a couple of reasons. So one is really high volume training of a very specific movement pattern, particularly one that's right at the edge of your strength and ability, much more likely to injure yourself. So training volume is the factor that is most strongly associated with injury risk, certainly in circus arts. And we actually talked about this with Emily Sherb, and I think also Stephanie Greenspan. I think both of those episodes back on the feed, you can go back and look at that, who are both researchers who have looked at this. So really high volume training, already kind of something that I would stay away from. Really high volume training for something that's already kind of at the edge of your ability and you can't do yet. A second red flag, right? And also particularly at the beginning of your polling journey, or if you're coming back to pole after a break, as an instructor, I think it is much more important that you are trying a wide variety of different types of movements in your body, that you are beginning to build that proprioception in a bunch of different ways. And also just from the motor learning research, we know that trying to do the same thing in the same way over and over and over again is not really the most efficient and not the best way to do skill learning. You want to try a lot of variation. So if you're working on inversions, for example, different parts to inversions, of course. So you may be doing like core focused movements on the pole. Maybe you're not inverting, but maybe you're working on like, let's say a chair spin, which is going to help you work on lifting your legs. It's going to help on, you building your mental understanding of your relationship with the pole. Or you may be working on let's say shoulder mount prep, right? Which is going to be helpful for building the back strength. It's going to be really helpful for again, building your understanding of where you are in relationship with the ground. Even if you're working on a basic inversion, even if shoulder mounts are nowhere near where you are currently, working on, similar sorts of muscle activations in different positions is going to be way better for your learning. It's going to happen faster. It's going to reduce your injury risk. It's going to help your brain. You're going to learn more about, the world of pole. And also, depending on what your goals are, if what you are interested in doing is performing and dancing or freestyling or really finding, just sort of pole movement, probably in those situations, you're not going to be doing the same thing over and over and over again for 3 minutes. You're probably going to want to do a lot of different things. So I think it's really important to build a wide vocabulary. And especially as a newer polar or a returning polar, you want to have lots of options. So that as you go through and you're doing different things, and one day you're like, oh, I'm so sore in my hamstrings or whatever, I don't want to do anything with a leg hook. Well, I have other things I can do because I've built this wide vocabulary of movements, so I can still spend time on the pole. This would be in a situation where you're not injured, you're just sort of sore and tired in a specific body part and you want to give it a bit of a rest. So like you can still do things on the pole, but you're not, continuing to stress, parts of your body that are already under a lot of stress and need time to recover. So I see this a lot. I see this a lot in situations where people have like a big goal move that they're working on. Just working on that goal move every single training session for the majority of the training session, I would highly, highly, highly recommend against. That's number 2. Proper warm-up is key, number 1. Number 2, avoid high volume training of a specific trick. And then number 3, and this is particularly for home polers who started as home polers, if you haven't worked with an instructor through a structured curriculum, you haven't gone to a studio, hopefully most studios have curriculum that's structured that you're working through, you're probably missing some foundational movements. There are probably some things that you are going to need at some point in your pole journey that I think most people would consider sort of basics, fundamentals, things that you need to build on that you've probably missed. And again, this is the problem with the autodidact, right? Like anyone who is teaching themselves something outside of a community of practice, outside of having a structured curriculum that's been designed by someone who is much more knowledgeable about that thing, you're going to get weird holes, right? It's the thing that happens. It happens to me when I teach myself things. But at this point, I know to look out for that and also to try and find, resources that can help me with that, right? So working with an instructor on a structured curriculum, maybe having an informational meeting with someone who's more knowledgeable about the thing that I am, to sort of get an idea of the shape of their knowledge and where mine doesn't match. But in pole, this can be very frustrating for you, because at some point you're going to try and do something and you'll be like, why doesn't this work? Why am I not, why haven't I... People are saying this is very easy, and also that seems to be the general consensus about this particular movement, but I've never done any of their preparatory work for this, so I'm finding it much more difficult than other people. And this is not the same thing as some person says this is very easy and everyone else is like, no, that's not. They're just, perhaps it is easy for them, but they are misrepresenting the general difficulty to the general population. So, you're probably missing some of those basic foundational things that you may be missing as a home poler. A big one that I often see is basic floor work shapes and transitions. Pole comes from stripping. It comes from this, erotic dance form. There are certain movements and positions on the floor that a lot of pole curriculums will build on, and the assumption will often be that you have done this on the floor already, right? So a great example here is fan kicks on the floor, I would say are fundamental preparation for fan kicks on the pole. If you can't do a fan kick on the floor, it's going to be really hard to do a fan kick on the pole, right? Or something like they have a lot of names. So I've heard caterpillar, I've heard stripper push up, I've heard speed bump. But the thing where you are starting in a child's position and you roll forward, come all the way down to the ground and drag yourself back to that child's position in a spine wave. I've also heard those, lots of different names for those. That's a core preparatory position for climbing. So if you've never done that spine wave on the ground, it's not going to magically show up when you're on the pole, right? Like you haven't built that understanding of what your body's going to feel like in that position. If you've never done that ever and you tried to do it on the pole, you're going to have a bad time. So basic floor work shapes and transitions, I often find that self-taught polers don't have a good foundation here. So just good to know, something that you may want to add to your training. The different grips for spins. This is a big one. I would say there's probably between 10 and 20 foundational spin grips that I would expect a sort of an accomplished poler to be familiar with. Not necessarily every one of them is going to be your favorite, but you should know what they feel like. You should be able to do them. You should be able to do them on both sides. You should be able to hold them for a while. And if you are only working on, 3 spins that all use the same grip, and then you're like, no, I'm good with this, I'm going to move on to inversions, you're going to have a really hard time once you start trying to do things up the pole, because a lot of times the assumption is you have already played with this grip down the pole. So of course it's going to be easy for you now. And if you haven't, that's just going to be a hole in your education and you're really, really going to struggle. So different grips for spins. Also different holds and contact points. This is one that I've really been noticing recently, that folks will be interested in, let's say working on an aerial inversion, but they aren't familiar with figurehead, or basically it's a inverted brass hook position, which is the starting position for aerial inversions, the easiest starting position for aerial inversions. And if you've never learned that, well, I don't think you should have been working on inversions if you didn't understand that contact point in the air first. But I mean, that's just like my personal preference as an instructor. But if you've never learned that, aerial inversions are going to be really hard because you don't know the starting position. right? And so, fundamental hold shapes, I would say there's fewer of these. There's probably like, I don't know, 6 or 7 that I would say are the foundational holds of pole that I would expect, again, every accomplished poler to know, to be able to do on both sides, to be able to hold for a while. You may not love it. And I'll say this, Superman is not one of them. I don't think that Superman is a foundational hold. Honestly, I think you can go an entire whole career without ever doing Superman, but there are some movements that, again, like that figurehead, I'm trying to remember what else it's called. It's called something different in Britain, but it's the same as a brass monkey hold in your inside knee, in your armpit. The inside knee is slightly internally rotated to hold you on the pole. The hip is a contact point. You can do it with stronghold arms. That sort of foundational position, again, absolutely just a requirement for aerially inverting. And I've definitely seen a lot of self-taught polers who are like, oh, I'm ready to aerially invert, and they just don't know the starting position. So again, a reason that you'd work with a teacher, right, is to learn that, those specific foundational core movements and then be able to build on them. Also working with different body orientations and understanding the orientation of your body to the pole. And this is something that I think for a lot of people just happens organically as a sort of instinctual thing as they begin to do pole more and more. It's something that I teach explicitly because I think it's very helpful, again, particularly for people who may not have the best proprioception, who are still working on developing that skill. And again, hypermobile folks in particular, I've noticed that this seems to be something where intentionally instructing it seems to help those folks pick moves up a little bit faster, right? So I often talk about where's your belly button pointed, and I'm using this as a proxy for hip orientation to the pole, right? But also things like being upright as opposed to being tilted to one side, as opposed to being wrapped around the pole, being able to put your body in a variety of positions with the pole and understanding what each position is and what positions it's easy to move between and what positions it's going to be much more challenging to move between. I think it's just, again, I think most people will develop instinctually as they continue to do pole. I think explicit instruction can also be helpful, but that's something that I would expect every accomplished poler to know and understand. And also weight shift and dynamics, right? A great example here is, again, I would expect in an accomplished poler, any accomplished poler, to be able to come up behind the pole in a basic spin hold, a baseball hold, whatever you call it, and swing their weight smoothly in a straight line behind the pole to the other side, right? And that sounds very straightforward, right? To go from standing on one side of the pole to standing on the other side of the pole, not in a semicircle, but moving in a straight line. But being able to do that suggests to me, A, you understand how to hold weight, B, you understand how to control your path, and C, it's actually deceptively difficult because most movements where we're holding our weight in the pole, we want to curve around the pole. So being able to do it in a straight line tells me that you can adjust how close you are to the pole throughout the course of your spin, which is a very important skill as you begin to move up and do more and more dynamic skills. So, and that's something that, again, if you're just self-teaching, if you're sort of putting together your own curriculum from a bunch of online tutorials, or you're trying to follow, an Instagram curriculum that you're sort of designing yourself based on what looks cool and attainable and interesting, those are things you may not be getting. So basic floor work, grips for spins, basic holds, different body orientations, weight shifts and dynamics, all things that, to be a, I don't like levels. I'll talk about that in a second. But I think to be someone who has a good understanding of the pole, who is accomplished, who can do different things, who is a flexible mover, and I mean flexible in that you can do different movements, not necessarily that you have a lot of flexibility. These are things that I would want for every pole dancer to pick up on their pole journey, and I think it's going to make your life easier. I think it's going to open things up for you, and I also think it's going to help you really develop a clearer understanding of what is possible with pole, what is easy with pole, and how to make impossible things possible and possible things easy, which is, I don't know, at least for me, that's the sort of the goal of mastery, right? Is I want to be able to do things that were really hard at one point in a way that is efficient and feels good to me and maybe looks cool to people if performance is a goal that you are working towards. So those are the three main things. You gotta have a warm-up, you gotta plan your training, which is necessary to have a good warm-up. You wanna try a lot of different things and not just keep working on the same trick over and over and over again at a high volume. How do you avoid that? And how do you avoid getting into a rut? It's planning your training. You gotta plan your training. And also you're probably missing some foundational movements, holds, contact points, some things that are gonna be super helpful for you as you move on in your pole journey, and that I would really want every pole dancer to be able to learn. How do you fill in those gaps? Well, you got to plan your training. This is all about how you have to plan your training. And if that's not something that you have, capacity for, I don't necessarily think that you always need to be working with an instructor. I think there's definitely a place for self-directed movement. It's something that's part of my pole practice. I also do take classes, but this is why you would work with an instructor, right? To help you find these gaps, to help you do this planning, to help you, make sure that you are doing different things in different ways, to give you different options, different variations. Oh, we were actually talking about this last night. One of my students who's been doing pole for ages and ages and ages. We were working on Princess Grip shoulder mount because we're doing shoulders this month, and I think that that's a really it's a shouldery move, and I think it worked well with the other things that we were doing in class that night. And she was like, I've literally never heard of or seen this grip before, but it feels amazing for me. And at the same time, another student was like, this is awful. This does not feel good in my body at all. Not in a way that hurt, but just she was not feeling particularly strong in it, which is fine. Different moves are going to feel good for different people, and that's totally normal. It's going to depend on your body. It's going to depend on what else you're doing with your movement. There's just going to be a lot of variation in what works for who. But my point is that this is someone who's been doing pole for a really long time and just didn't know about this grip. I would say that this is not one of the ones that I would consider a foundational grip. Princess Grip is definitely a little bit more of a specialized grip. I wouldn't expect everyone in pole to be familiar with it. But, if you're a more advanced mover, if you are working on shoulder mount, I would hope that you would run across it at some point, right? And you'd have this, understanding of like, what are all the grips I can use for my shoulder mount prep? When would each one work? Which one do I like better? Which one works better for my body and my proportions? And those are things that I think an instructor can really, save you years of heartache on, because they've already had the years of experience. They can just tell you what you need to know. And they can, even better, tell you what you didn't know you needed to know. And that's, part of what you're paying for. And then a final point that I think a lot of folks don't necessarily realize, particularly if you are maybe home polling now, but you used to go to a studio, or you're only sort of familiar with competitions. So there's not a lot of standardization in the pole industry, and a lot of people will sort of refer to levels. And I think there's kind of a misconception that levels are universal and standard and everyone knows what like a level 4 poler is. Absolutely not the case. Absolutely not the case. Levels are pretty much studio dependent. The way that different studios do them varies tremendously. Personally, I don't do levels. I teach, all my classes are for dancers of all abilities. Well, I mean, I don't teach like crazy hard stuff. I'm teaching classes for people who do pole for fun like me. But I don't assume that, there's sort of like chunks of dancers and like level 1 dancers know this and level 2 dancers know this and level 3 dancers know this. And also what different studios will expect a level 1, level 2, level 3, etc. dancer to know varies tremendously. So it's not actually very helpful to hear that like, oh, something's a level 6 move or whatever. But it doesn't mean anything out of the context of the specific leveling system. Also, leveling systems are generally designed by, one person or a group of people. Sometimes they're based on their experience with their students, sometimes they're not. And often what it ends up being is sort of a ranking of how difficult one specific person or a small group of people that may have the similar body type found more or less difficult. And as a result, if you have a different body type, you may find that something that someone's like, oh, this is a level 5 move, this is super difficult for me. You might be like, oh, this is a level 2 move, I can do this all day. Easy peasy, not an issue, right? And there's certainly things that I think most people would agree make something more hard or dangerous, right? Fewer contact points, being farther away from the pole, being inverted, all of those things that make just make the mechanics more difficult. But there's a wide range of things within there, and what is easy for one person is going to be hard for another person. So yes, levels are not, unless you are very familiar with the specific studio or the specific leveling system and why things are different levels, not necessarily going to be very helpful. Also, something to keep in mind is you may look at the level requirements for something and be like, oh, I can do all of these things, this is the level I should be in. And then the curriculum may not be directly reflecting of that particular, the curriculum at a level may not directly reflect what's required to get into that level, right? So a good example for me, great example of this for me that I've had in my experience is I took a class at a studio. I was just going through town. This was a while ago. And their requirement for, between two levels is like, I don't remember what the numbers were, but like level 2 was you can do a basic invert, level 3 was you can do an aerial invert, and level 4 was you can do a shoulder mount. And I can do a shoulder mount, so I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'm level 4. That makes sense. And then the class itself was when I took it, and I don't know that this is always necessarily the case, but this was the case the time that I took it, was 100% just about doing handsprings. And I don't know if you know this, but hamstrings and shoulder mounts are different moves. And if you can do a shoulder mount, it does not necessarily follow that you can do a handspring, and vice versa, right? Skill specific. The training that we do in pole is really, really skill specific. Some things will transfer, right? Like I mentioned, the sort of like understanding of your relationship to the body and the pole, but then some things just won't. And I think the only difference between, the only big distinction, not overlap, that's what I was looking for. It's really the only big overlap between something like a handspring and something like a shoulder mount is that your hips are a little bit further away from the pole and it requires a lot of core strength, but the mechanics of it vary tremendously. You do not need anywhere near the range of shoulder mobility for shoulder mount that you do for handspring. Pushing strength is not really as much of a thing with shoulder mount. I'm thinking through the different... Yeah, not pretty much really at all. Maybe a little bit in Princess. Right? So the mechanics of those movements are so different that saying you can do a shoulder mount is absolutely not very helpful for saying, and also you can do a handspring, right? So what I'm saying is, even progressions that are based on specific moves, it doesn't necessarily follow that the curriculum at that specific level is going to also be based on that specific move, right? And that's just something I think it's good to know if you are working by yourself, if you're working with other people, if you're trying to like take classes or follow tutorials. I would really evaluate a movement on that specific movement, on your familiarity with contact points, on your strength, on your flexibility, and the specific requirements of that move, rather than trying to rely on a level system. It's just not that helpful. And especially at the higher levels, as movements become more and more specialized, it's really, really variable. What the skills that you need, the things that are going to feel easy, once you get to, past the sort of foundational level that I would expect all polars to sort of pick up at some point, things diverge radically, and things are going to be your body proportions come into play a lot more at higher level pole. I think that's what I'm saying, right? As things start to get really, really challenging, you tend to see more specialization in specific moves and specific, pathways, depending on the particular body and preferences of the instructor, particularly in a school that's not using a set curriculum. So just something to know. I do really, really try to introduce movements in my classes that I don't like, right? That I know are not great for my body type, but that a lot of folks might really enjoy and benefit from. So example from a recent class is that we did Twisted Jasmine. I have very short arms and a very long torso. Reaching the pole behind my butt is very hard for me. Twisted Jasmine is very much a sometimes move. When I was demoing in class, I could not do it. But about the half of the class who had never done it before picked it up instantly because it was much more suited to their body proportions and had a great time playing with the shape and exploring new pathways. And again, it's a shape that's, I won't say it's impossible for me. I have done it in the past. It is just very, very challenging. It's not something I'm ever going to choose to do in a freestyle, for example. And you're going to see more of that sort of specialization based on body and body preferences at higher levels and with more challenging movements. So that was an aside I tacked on there just because it's something I've been thinking about. I don't know that it's quite long enough for its own podcast episode, but also something that I think it's very important for folks to know, especially if they're training at home, especially if they're training with a lot of different instructors or they're going to different studios, they're doing stuff online. So, all right, 3 things every home puller should know. Got to do a proper warm-up. You have to structure and plan your training. You want to avoid high volume training of a specific trick. You have to structure and plan your training, and you're probably missing some foundational movements, so you should structure and plan your training. And if structuring and planning your training isn't something that you're up for all the time, work with an instructor, right? That's what we're here for. That's what our skill set's in. Hopefully. Hopefully. And certainly it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and that's part of what I'm bringing to class, right? Is I've done all that structuring for you. So that and, you know, a lot of experience in pole and working with different polars. So with that, that's all I got for you today. I hope this was helpful. This was interesting. A lot of the stuff that I'm referenced today, there are studies on, but it's sort of also just kind of like general knowledge in exercise science. So I'm not going to go into specifics. But if there's one of these things that you want a specific study on, feel free to reach out and I'll dig up a citation for you. But otherwise, I'll see you in just a couple weeks. Have a good one. Stay safe, stay warm and or cool, depending on where you are in the hemispheres. And I'll talk to you very soon. Bye. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something. If you want to do more research on your own, if we talked about specific studies, I always try to have the citations in the show notes. You can check them out for yourself. A great place to continue our learning. Speaking of continuing your learning, if you do want to work with me as a pole instructor, I teach online at my online studio, Slink Through Strength, and it would be great to have you come join us. I teach freestyle flow, I teach conditioning, I teach flexibility, and I teach pole in the nerdiest way possible. But we have a good time, and we'd love to have you join us if that sounds like fun for you. And if not, no worries. Either way, I'll see you in the next episode. Have a good one.